But I want to get you focused on how we could solve this problem nationally first. So I'm going to start, though, by recognizing what increasingly strikes me as the incredible complexity that this problem presents. And when I first started in this area, I thought there was a problem, and I figured a solution to that problem. And then I recognized there was a second problem that solution provided, which required a second solution, and then that solution itself created its own problem, which provided its own solution, which then produced its own problem, which then I'm finally down to the final solution. I think this is it. But this solution is about what I think we need to do here. And so that's the argument I want to push you with here. So let's start with the problem. The core problem is this institution. This institution, which is corrupt. But by corrupt, I don't mean brown paper bag corrupt. I don't mean Rob Blagojevich corrupt. I don't mean corrupt in any criminal sense, quid pro quo bribery or anything else that the law tries to regulate. Instead, I mean corrupt relative to the framers' baseline about how that institution would function. The framers gave us what they said was a republic. And by a republic, they explained they meant a representative democracy. And by a representative democracy, Federalist 52 describes a government that would have a branch that would be dependent upon the people alone. Okay, so here's their model of government. We have the people, we have the government. I do my own slides. It's cool the way that bounces like that. People and the government. This exclusive dependency that would assure that this institution remained focused on what this entity, us, wants. Here's the problem. Our Congress has evolved a different dependence. Not just a dependence upon the people, but increasingly a dependence upon the funders. As members spend between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress and to get their party back into power, they develop, as any of us would, a sixth sense. A constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shapeshifters, as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will raise money, not on issues 1 to 10, but on issues 11 to 1,000. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, "Always lean to the green." Then to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. Now the point is, this is a dependence too. But it's a different and conflicting dependence from a dependence upon the people alone because, surprise, surprise, the funders are not the people. 0.26%. I know you're thinking he doesn't know how to do fractions, he's a lawyer, but no, I really mean 0.26%. 1/4% of Americans give more than $200 in a congressional election. 0.05% give the maximum amount in a congressional election. 0.01%, the 1% of the 1% give more than $10,000 in an election cycle. My favorite statistic so far, 0.000063% have given 80% of super PAC contributions so far. That's 196 Americans have given 80% of the super PAC contributions in the presidential election cycle so far. So the Occupy Wall Street people are so proud of that. We are the 99% slogan. Bad marketing, right? If they have the 99.74%, the 99.95%, the 99.99%, the 99.99937%, depending upon which statistic you want to pick to measure their relative lack of influence compared with the influence of those who fund the elections. Now this is, the Supreme Court doesn't get this yet, but it will, corruption. It is a corruption of the dependence that our framers intended. It is dependence corruption because it steers the government away from the representative democracy our framers intended. Now, a lot of people look at this and say, well, who cares what the framers wanted? They had a lot of mistakes, you know, in their design. Maybe this was one too. Maybe it's a good thing that Congress doesn't focus on what we, the people, want, and instead focus on what we, or they, the funders, want. But the point about this is something we should care about, because this corruption has an effect. Its first effect is that Americans believe, and it's a separate question, but I think Americans are right, but let's focus on what Americans believe, that money buys results in Congress. Quote unquote. Survey we did for the book that I published last fall. 75% of Americans believe money buys results in Congress. A little bit more Democrats than Republicans, but I guarantee you before the Republicans took control of the House, there were just as many Republicans as Democrats. So whether it's 2/3 or 3/4, here's the one thing we all believe: money buys results in Congress. And that leads to point 2. That belief erodes trust in the institution of Congress. Last year, ABC and the New York Times reported that 9% of Americans have confidence in Congress. 9%. We have to put this in context. It's certainly the case at the time of the Revolution, more people had trust in the British Crown than have faith in our Congress today. And that leads to point 3. This low trust erodes participation. Rock the Vote, which registers and turns out young voters, and registered and turned out the largest number of young voters in the history of voting in America in 2008. Found in 2010 a significant number of their voters were just not going to turn out. So they asked them, they polled them, why? And the number one reason by far, 2-to-1 of the second highest reason, was no matter who wins, corporate interests will still have too much power and prevent real change. And it's not just kids. The vast majority of Americans who could have voted in 2010 did not vote, in part at least because of this belief. That is the problem. And that problem then suggests a solution. If it's a systemic problem here that the funders are not the people, there's a systemic solution, which is to make it so that the funders are the people. To give them away, that looks like give Congress away. A lot of people want to do that. Nobody will take Congress, so I'm not doing that. I give Congress a way to fund without fault, without selling their soul and thereby alienating most of America. And the one way, and I increasingly think the only way to do this, is to embrace something I want to call here citizen-funded campaigns. Okay, so you think, well, what is a citizen-funded campaign? The first point is, the internet notwithstanding, we have to recognize we're still going to have to fund campaigns. Politics is not going to become free just because email is just about free. Okay, but the question then is, fund campaigns by whom? Funded by whom? Citizens or non-citizens? Non-citizens like the Chinese or the French, or whether or not a corporation is a person. Nobody has ever said a corporation is a United States citizen. So between citizens or non-citizens, most Americans look at this and think, no-brainer, citizens should be funding campaigns. Okay, but which citizens? Should it be some of our citizens or all of our citizens? Because right now we have a system for funding campaigns where just some of citizens effectively fund campaigns. These are the large dollar-funded campaigns funded by a tiny percentage of Americans, the 0.26, 0.05, the 0.01, producing an extraordinary inequality in the per capita influence of citizens. So if you look at income brackets, and the relative influence measured in per capita contribution, it's an extraordinary inequality. There are people down there that are just really tiny. You can't really see them. But an extraordinary inequality so that this top 1% per capita contributes more than 10 times the amount of the total bottom 99%. In a certain sense, this is really very weird. We run in America 2 kinds of elections every election cycle. 2 of them, one a voting election and the second a money election. The voting election, which happens twice, the primary and the general, but the money election, which is continuous. Every single day, you decide whether to send your money to Romney or to Obama or to somebody else. The Constitution has been interpreted to say that in the voting election, our influence has to be just about equal. So that if one district is designed so that it has more voting power than another, even 0.1%, you got to redraw the districts to make sure that the weight of your vote is equal to the weight of my vote. But in the money election, there's no obligation of equality at all. Radical inequality on the basis of income. And this is the result of a system where we allow some to fund elections. We have an election system where we're funded by the tiniest slice of the 1%, evoking again this great image from exactly 100 years ago of not a democracy, but a government controlled by this tiny 1%. So when I talk about citizen-funded elections, I'm obviously not talking about this system. But that invites some people to think about the exact opposite. Citizen-funded election in the sense of what people typically call public funding of elections, the sort of thing that the Federal Election Commission does through their presidential funding of presidential elections. This system is hated by most Americans. It's hated in part because of the sense that the government is deciding how much you get to run your campaign versus how much you get to run your campaign. And then conservatives are very sensitive to the idea that my money is subsidizing your speech. This is not a concern of mine, but I understand how people think it's weird in politics that I be taxed to subsidize your speech, which I might disagree with. And of course, everybody thinks that the institution has become bloated and bureaucratic. It seems to be the nature of government institutions. So this bloated and bureaucratic institution, which doesn't inspire confidence of most people. And so when I talk about citizen-funded elections, I also don't mean public funding of elections. Instead, fortunately for me, I left space in the middle here for something that I want to call citizen-funded elections, but instead a kind of bottom-up citizen funding of elections. So these are systems that are voluntary, small-dollar funded campaigns, where candidates opt into taking small-dollar contributions only. And then the system, in different ways, amplifies those contributions to make it so that people can afford to run winning campaigns, never taking large dollar contributions. Now, there are many versions of this system. There are 3 states that now have a version of this system: Arizona, Maine, and Connecticut. These systems allow people to run winning campaigns without large contributions. They answer the criticism that the government is controlling how much you get to run your campaign, because how much you get is a function of how much people are actually contributing, and that's matched, but it's still people making the choice of a contribution. It doesn't yet answer the second criticism, which is that my money is subsidizing your speech. Because the matching grants are of such size that often it is the case that effectively your money is subsidizing my speech, I hope, or my money is subsidizing your speech. So that led me in my book to think about whether there was a way to achieve the objectives, small dollar funded campaigns, and answer both of these criticisms: no government control and no subsidy of other people's speech. So that led me to what I call the Grant and Franklin project. Okay. So here's the way the Grant and Franklin project starts. You've got to assume with me that all of us contribute, in quotes, at least $50 to the federal treasury, whether it's income tax, Social Security tax, payroll tax, gasoline tax. I hope nobody pays the cigarette tax, but I take it some people do. Okay, but whatever the tax is, the total amount all of us contribute, all voters, is at least $50. So this system says, okay, let's take that first $50 and let's rebate it back to the voter in the form of democracy voucher. Okay, you see I'm pushing all the conservative buttons here. Rebate democracy voucher. Now, a candidate can get this democracy voucher if you give it to that candidate, but only if that candidate agrees to fund the campaign only with vouchers, plus contributions limited to $100 a citizen. So $50 vouchers, grants, $100 contributions, Franklin. Now, $50 a voter is a large amount of money, $7 billion. The total amount raised and spent in 2010 was $1.8 billion in congressional elections. So this is about 3 times that amount, real money. But the critical feature of this system is, rather than coming from the tiniest fraction of the 1%, it is representative. It's coming from all of us, or at least those who choose to participate. Let's be optimistic, 50% or 60% of us who choose to participate in this. So it is all of us funding, but from a bottom-up design. So when I talk about citizen-funded elections, I'm talking about a system like that, where we're getting only citizens and all citizens to participate in the funding of elections, so that this institution is once again dependent upon, exclusively dependent upon, all of us, all citizens, the people. Right, so I said there was a problem, it was corruption. I said that we've got the solution to this problem. It's what I want to call citizen-funded elections. But that invites its own problem here. Because people say, well, are citizen-funded elections enough anymore? given the non-citizen-funded super PACs, if we have just citizen-funded campaigns, would it be enough against them? And I think the answer has got to be no. We've entered this age of the super PAC, not just a happy Colbert super PACs, but increasingly a very dark version of these super PACs. This is Tony Soprano over here, who practice a kind of influence that would be very familiar to Tony Soprano, but the Supreme Court doesn't yet understand. And it was explained to me most clearly by Evan Bayh, who was on a panel responding to a skeptical question about whether money actually influences what Washington does. Turns out political scientists are not sure about that. It takes a PhD to be a political scientist, but you know, you're pretty sure, I'm pretty sure, but they're not sure yet. But so that was the question that was being asked to Evan Bayh, and Evan Bayh's response said, you know, rolled his eyes, and he said, "You have no clue about how Citizens United has changed Washington." It used to be the case that an incumbent in Washington was confident. He was the king. As long as he didn't sleep with an intern, he was guaranteed to have a chance to come back to Washington. Now, everybody is terrified that 30 days before an election, some super PAC is going to come in and drop $1 million on the other side of the campaign. So what does a candidate do? What does an incumbent do? Well, reframing what Evan Bayh said a little bit, what an incumbent has to do is he has to find a way to buy super PAC insurance. Insurance, so that if somebody comes in and drops $1 million on one side, the insurance company drops $1 million on this side. I don't mean literally insurance, but I mean effectively insurance. And so how do we buy insurance? Well, all of us know the answer to this. You pay your premium in advance. You behave in a way that gives super PACs on your side a reason to want to support you if you need to be supported when super PACs on the other side attack you. So, Senator, we'd love to help you, but we can only support people who vote 80% with us according to our scorecard. Now you as a senator have a target, a way you have to behave in order to have the insurance that if you are attacked, you will have the support of that super PAC. So without spending $1, the super PAC achieves the ability to change the way senators and representatives behave so that they're protected in the case of an attack on the other side. And if you think about this, this is why transparency or disclosure alone is solve the problem. Because there's nothing to disclose here. There's nothing to show anybody. You know, the effect is achieved without anybody spending any money at all. It is the way a protection racket works. And this is exactly what the Supreme Court gave us in Citizens United. A system of protection money that incumbents now must secure. So what that means, I believe, is that we're going to need more than just citizen-funded campaigns, and that describes what we can think of as problem 2, and that invites an obvious solution to. If this case must be changed, then what we're going to need is either this justice to flip, which he's done, but okay, we need Justice Kennedy to flip, or we're going to need an amendment to the Constitution. That amendment should respond, in my view, to this case. And what this court did not say was that because corporations are persons, Congress can't regulate their speech. Instead, what the court was doing was focusing on the First Amendment. It says Congress can make no law which abridges the freedom of speech. And as Scalia explained in his concurrence, the amendment is written in terms not of speech, not of speakers. Its text offers no foothold for excluding any category of speaker, whether person or citizen or dolphin. Nobody can be excluded. It's just speech that can't be excluded. So we therefore are left simply with the question whether the speech at issue in this case is speech covered by the First Amendment. No one says otherwise, and obviously they shouldn't because this is political speech, so it is speech that is being regulated, not persons who are being given certain kinds of rights. Thus, in my view, it's not even clear that if we had an amendment to the Constitution that says corporations are not persons, it's not clear that would overturn Citizens United. Because the court could embrace Justice Scalia's reasoning and say whether or not they're persons, you can't regulate political speech. That's what the First Amendment means. So instead of an amendment that says corporations are not persons, what I think we need is an amendment that goes directly at the problem. That says Congress shall have the power To limit, I don't think they should have the power to ban, but to limit independent political expenditures within so many days of an election. So they have the power to target exactly the thing that has exploded since Citizens United, independent political expenditures. But you notice I say this is number 2 in an amendment because it's really critical to keep people focused on what we need in number 1. Congress shall fund federal elections publicly through a system I would prefer, like the small dollar funded system, but whatever the system is, they've got to fund public election publicly so that it is all of us who are funding elections, not just the tiniest fraction of the 1%. Now, both of these changes are essential. Both of these changes. So if we have a problem, which is Citizens United, what we need as a solution is an anti-Citizens United amendment that responds to that problem directly. Okay. But unfortunately, that gets us to problem 3. Because it's not even clear that it's possible. Forget the amendment to the Constitution. It's not even clear it's possible to get a statute through Congress to give us citizen-funded campaigns. And that was made most pronounced, most clear to me by this man, Jim Cooper, who's a Democrat from Virginia. He's been in Congress as long as all but about 20 members of Congress. Cooper said, you have to understand, Congress has become a kind of farm league for K Street. K Street with the lobbyist work. Right? Members and staffers and bureaucrats have an increasingly common business model in their head, a career path. Their career path focused not on serving the citizens, focused on their life after government, their life as lobbyists. Public Citizen calculated between 1998 and 2004, 50% of senators left to become lobbyists, 42% of members of the House. Those numbers have only gone up. And as United Republic calculated 2 months ago, a post that they put on their blog, the average salary increase of a member of Congress moving to a lobbyist, 1,452%. Now, in a world like that, everyone depends upon this system surviving. That's their guaranteed retirement into wealth. So if they depend upon this system surviving, how could we ever expect them to change this? And that's just a statute. How could we ever expect 2/3 of them to vote to change this through a constitutional amendment? And I think the answer we've got to accept is that we can't expect them to do this on their own. They won't do this on their own. And that's the frame of problem 3. So that invites us to think about solution 3. Okay. So the Chatterati say that the interesting division in American politics is between the left side and the right side. I think the interesting division in politics is between the inside and the outside. The inside, the kind of inside the Beltway, Washington, D.C., and the outside, the rest of America. And when you listen to what the inside talks about, or doesn't talk about, and what the outside is focused on, increasingly, to remix this book's title a little bit, we see that Washington is from Mars and we are from Earth. Now, this inside-outside division points to a difference in the politics. And I want to focus on the outsider's politics, which I'm going to call the exopolitics. Outsider politics, which is not a politics of politicians. This is a citizen politics. Not citizens trying to become congressmen, but citizens who are increasingly engaged to demand that their politics change. And if we think about the last 14 years, we can see wave after wave of what's self-described as this open source energy trying to push for this kind of political change. I think Move On in 1998 is the most interesting original example of this. When the insiders are focused on the really serious question of whether a president lied about having sex with an intern, and the outsiders said, well, wait a minute, you were going to impeach the man on the basis of his lying about having sex? We have real problems in this country. So 2 outsiders, Berkeley programmers, put together a list within a couple of weeks, millions of people have joined, Republicans and Democrats, to demand that Congress move on from this crazy question, censure the president, and move on to address the issues that are important to America. And this was totally unseen before. Within a month, we had a massive political movement that began to push change inside of Washington. I think the Tea Party in 2009 is another example of this kind of exopolitics movement. Ground swell It gets amplified, of course, by Fox News and lots of rich contributors. But it is, in this group at least, Tea Party Patriots, a genuine grassroots movement that finds expression using the infrastructure of the net. I think the Occupy movement in 2011 was another example of this exo-political movement. I think the fact that the network stopped Hollywood from passing the SOPA and PIPA legislation at the beginning of 2012 is an extraordinary example of this exo-political movement. And since this time, we've seen example after example of people who have found the anger of the net has forced them to behave very differently. Leading this Politico article to describe cyberbullying, which increasingly they recognize this activism on the internet to be. Cyberbullying, this tech insider dubbed it. Of course, I don't really care much about these tech companies, poor tech companies here. But the point is recognizing this energy is something new and powerful and has enormous potential. But we've got to understand that the leadership of this exo-political energy is very different. There's a great book here, The Starfish and the Spider, which distinguishes between the kind of command and control that a spider has, which is all in his tiny brain, and a starfish, which is no central nervous system, no brain. And what these movements are not spiders, they are starfish, meaning you cannot command them to do something. You cannot command this new exo-political movement to rise up and do something. You can nudge them, you can encourage them, but you need to think of this as more like the politics of body surfing, where you've got to stand around and wait for the right wave, but once that right wave comes, then you need to think about how to feed it and respect it and encourage it. And my view is, if there is hope about bringing about the kind of change that we need, the hope is here in this birth of what I call exopolitics. All right, so I said the insiders were captured. The solution to the insiders captured is exopolitics. That leads me to my final and most profound of these problems. Okay. This corruption that I'm talking about here is going to require a constitutional solution. Even if you don't think of constitutional in the amend the Constitution sense, even if you think about it in just a fundamental change sense, it's going to require a constitutional solution. There has been one time in our history where we have tried a constitutional solution without a cross-partisan movement. That was the Civil War. Not a great example. Every other time we've had a constitutional movement, it has been a cross-partisan political movement. And by cross-partisan, I don't mean bipartisan. I mean a movement that cuts across partisan lines, that finds a way to unite some Democrats and some Republicans into a common view of what the problem is, not forcing Democrats and Republicans to give up their very different views about what good public policy is. So that's what we need, but here's the problem. This exo-political movement is extremely polarized. Like everyone in our society today, politicians, political parties, the media, even the .orgs that feed these organizations, they practice a business model of polarization. A business model that says the only way we profit is by dividing people against people. That's the way we make the most money. That's the way we get the most members to join our list. That's the way we get the most energy out to the polls. Division. We've become this polarized culture, polarized Ray-Ban culture, polarized but very cool because we're in this sense polarized. Okay, that's what I want to think of as problem 4, and that puts us to what is the hardest solution here, problem solution number 4. Got to find a way to get beyond this us versus them. Get beyond this polarization. And I think it begins with the recognition. The recognition was inspired to me by Henry David Thoreau, writing in 1846 in his book written at Walden Pond, where he wrote, "There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil, to one who is striking at the roots." Call that one a root striker. And what a root striker sees in our current political context is that when you step back and connect the dots, whatever issues you care about, whether it's healthcare reform on the left or government bailouts on the right, whether it's global warming on the left or a complex tax system on the right, whether it's financial reform on the left or financial reform on the right, what this root striker recognizes is that we get no change in any of these issues until we change this corruption. But the problem we face today in our current political environment is there's a conspiracy of silence around this issue. Romney will not mention the issue once in the political campaign because he likes the system the way it is right now. And though Barack Obama doesn't like the system as it is right now, after doing nothing to change it for 3 years, I think he's a little too embarrassed to make this the central focus of his campaign. Indeed, there's a report that they've started to airbrush references to Citizens United from his web pages. So embarrassing is it to, on the one hand, be criticizing Citizens United, and on the other hand, supporting a super PAC supporting his re-election. So that forces us to think about how do we force this question back into the center of political debate, so that they have to talk about it. They have to think about what we can do about it, and we at least get Congress people to think about what we can do about it. So what do? I think there are 3 things. Number 1, those in this exopolitical movement need to find a way to change the character of that movement. So this exopolitical movement needs to form alliances that focus on a common ground. So an alliance. By alliance, I mean a diverse yet cross-partisan movement. I don't mean kumbaya, we all agree. We don't agree. I mean, we recognize our different disagreements, but we try to work together. But think about this kind of alliance, not this kind of alliance. Or for us, think about bringing together these kinds of groups into a common alliance. But we do that by getting them to focus on common ground. I don't mean a common end. We have no common end when you think about those different groups. What we have is a common enemy. And the common enemy is this root of corruption. It is this picture of the way our politics functions. We get people to focus on this common enemy and build an alliance to the end of addressing it. We begin to build the exopolitical movement that could possibly have the power to change the corruption inside the Beltway. But the second step in doing this is that we have to make the recognition of the root striker manifest. We have to show the world we think about it and care about it. To make it visible, to make the commitment to reform something existing politicians can't ignore. So we've been tinkering, and this is about to be launched in a big way with this conception in the context of what we call the anti-corruption pledge. So if you go to something called anticorruptionpledge.org, you have the chance to signal right now yourself which of these elements of reform you think are central to anti-corruption reform. So public funding of elections, limiting independent political expenditures, closing the revolving door, saying corporations are not persons. You pick. We give you the ability to then signal which you think are important on your own websites, or add your names to these collections of supporters and share it with your friends. But then once we get 10 million people who've made this commitment, then we turn them around on their representatives. And their representatives then are asked, in the name of the 50,000 people in this district who have made this commitment, we want you to make this commitment, to support the legislation, specific legislation that would bring these changes about. And the idea is if we can make this issue visible by getting enough people to make this kind of commitment, we can force it back into the center of political debate, where it has to be if we're going to get this kind of reform. And then finally, number 3, the most controversial of what I'm going to say. The Constitution imagines amendments in 2 different ways. The only way we've ever seen is when 2/3 of Congress propose an amendment that then gets sent out to the states. When that idea was originally debated by the framers of our Constitution, somebody raised the obvious question, what if Congress is itself a problem? So the framers put into the Constitution a second way to get an amendment before the states. And the second way is that the states have the power to call for a convention, an Article 5 convention, to propose amendments to change the Constitution, and then those proposals get sent out to the states in the same way that a proposal from Congress gets sent out to the state. Now, people are afraid of an Article 5 convention because they confuse it with a constitutional convention. Constitutional convention, the sort of thing that can do whatever the hell it wants, eliminate the Constitution or change the Constitution however it wants. It's not a constitutional convention. It is a convention that is called within the terms of Article 5. Its only power is a procedure for proposing amendments It has no power on its own to amend. Now, never before in our history have we had an Article 5 convention, but we came close once. We came close in 1911, during the last great anti-corruption movement in America, what we call now the progressive movement. And at that point, the Senate was appointed, and people believed that the appointed Senate was the core of corruption in Washington. So they called on Congress to make the Senate elected. Congress said, no chance. Congress refused to fix the Senate. So the states started calling for a convention. And when they were one state shy of enough to call for a convention, that terrified Washington, who thought, oh my God, what is a convention going to do? We've got to stop this convention movement. And the only way to stop the convention movement was to agree to fix the Senate. So they immediately passed a resolution to change the way the Senate was selected, to elect the Senate directly. This resolution, which then became the 17th Amendment, which created a direct election of Senate, and that stopped the call for a convention. And that's the thing I think we need at least to happen here. You can use this process for calling for a convention to create the pressure necessary on Washington to do the change that this outside the Beltway political movement demands. Maybe it grows into a convention, but even if it doesn't grow into a convention, it has the ability to crystallize the anger and frustration that I know all of us feel. And I increasingly think this is one, maybe the only possible means we have to grow this movement from the grassroots up, and make it something that counts. So I said problem number 4 is the polarized culture. The solution number 4 is to find a way to build and support this alliance focused on this common ground. Okay, let me just pull it together. So I said here are the ends we've got to aim at. We've got to say, number 1, we've got to get citizen-funded campaigns. Only citizens and all citizen-funded campaigns. Number 2, we may need an amendment to secure the power to limit independent political expenditures. And number 3, I think states like North Carolina need to start thinking about calling for a convention for the purpose of addressing what I call this corrupting influence of money in elections. And the means to bring this about has got to be a revived exo-political movement. When people look at those two things and they genuinely, honestly say, is it possible to imagine something like that happen? Recognizing how impossibly difficult it is to see a political movement supporting either of these two changes. And I struggle with this question of whether it's possible. At the end of my book, I describe a moment at Dartmouth speech where a woman stood up afterwards and said, okay, professor, you convinced me absolutely. There's no chance we can fix this. It's hopeless. Totally hopeless. As I write at the end of the book, when she said this to me, I had this moment where I reflected, thinking about, I have 3 young children, and my oldest is 8 now, and I thought, what if a doctor said to me, your son has terminal brain cancer? Hopeless. There's nothing you can do. Would I do nothing? Would I sit back and just accept the hopelessness? Of course not. Of course not. What love means is the willingness to act in the face of absolute improbability. Because what the hell else would you do? And when I had that thought, I then recognized it's the same for your love for country. Even we liberals love our country. Even we have the same love for country. And so when the numbers are calculated and somebody says it's impossible to build a movement that can overcome the enormous power inside the Beltway to preserve the system as they have it, I say doesn't matter. Irrelevant to what we should do. Because here's the fact. The occupiers are so obsessed with it. We are the 99%. On this issue, we are the 100%. 100%. Not the 99%, because when you start adding up the numbers, we lawyers round up. We are the 100%. There's nobody in our political system who would honestly stand up and defend the corruption that this government is. All of us, on the left and the right, recognize this institution is corrupt and we have to do something to fix it. When Ben Franklin was carried from the Constitutional Convention in 1787, he was stopped on the streets of Philadelphia by a woman who said to him, "Mr. Franklin, what have you wrought?" And Franklin said, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it. A republic, a representative democracy, a government dependent upon the people alone. We have lost that republic. And we have to do something. We have to do everything, all of us, to fix it." Thank you very much.
A couple minutes for questions. I know folks have to get to work, but surely there must be some questions for Dr. Lessig.
So how would an Article 5 convention work? Like, who would call the convention? Who would go and attend it? How does that work?
So states pass resolutions, say Congress has to call a convention. Then Congress actually calls a convention. And Congress, when it calls a convention, I believe, this is contested, but I believe has the power to set the terms. So you can address the following issues. And I think it sets those terms based on what people have called a convention for. Right? That much is pretty clear. The hardest, the craziest bit of my suggestion here is I follow Sandy Levinson from Texas in saying that when that convention is called, we ought to populate it with randomly selected delegates. Because it'd be a nightmare if politicians went to that convention. And it'd be a nightmare if we ran elections for that convention. Right? We should randomly select it. Okay, now people have no confidence in randomly selected conventions. So one of the things we're doing is we're running a project right now to run a series of mock conventions, where we randomly select 300 people, bring them into a room, give them the information they need to think about these problems, let them deliberate, and come up with their solutions. And what we found in the tests we've run is that what ordinary people come up with when they think about how to fix this republic is 1,000,000 times better than what the politicians talk about. It's a pretty low bar, I accept, but still. As people begin to think about the idea of what citizen juries in this context can do, I think they increasingly become more and more confident that maybe people not connected to special interests, people thinking about what's in the interest of the nation, could make the right proposals. And that's the critical thing. Nobody's talking about giving them the power to change the Constitution. All that they're doing is the power to suggest changes to the Constitution. So it's like a symposium at the Yale Law Journal. All of those are crazy, those symposiums at the Yale Law Journal. But maybe this one comes up with some good ideas, which then get considered by the states, and 3/4 of the states have to pass them. So that means 13 states can block any change, which when you think about the layout of the country, there are certainly 13 red states and 13 blue states, so neither side needs to worry about craziness from an extreme capturing this kind of change.
Yeah, you mentioned 3 states that made progress with the public funding of elections.
Yeah.
Has it made any difference in Connecticut, Arizona, and Maine?
People in those states say it's made very significant difference. Connecticut, I think, is the most interesting. In the first year of Connecticut's system, 78% of elected representatives opted into the system initially, and they won. 78% of the people who won. And that meant that they could win their elections without ever taking large contributions from anybody. And immediately after this new legislature was seated, they considered a bill which had been considered for 30 years, every single year, a bill to change the funding or the pricing on bottle returns. And set at a very low number. They wanted to increase it to make it okay. This has been blocked by the bottling industry in Connecticut every single year. The very first bill that's brought up, they bring it up, it gets passed overwhelmingly. And the Secretary of State said, this is astonishing. Imagine legislation on the merits. Never heard of before, right? Legislation on the merits. And once they were free of these interests, they were able to just decide what makes sense. Now, there's no guarantee they make the right decision. They'll make lots of stupid decisions. But when they make a stupid decision, you'll think it's either because there are too many Democrats or too many Republicans. You won't think it's because of the money. And that's the critical confidence that we have to restore in the institutions so that we take them seriously and rather than just think of them as these.
So why not recommend North Carolina do that? It seems like that would be one of your top
So
recommendations.
2 years ago, we were here because North Carolina was on the cusp of thinking about doing something just like that. And they chose not to. And they chose not to, and then they got the election in 2010. And they will not choose to do it for a very long, until that legislature has changed. But you have something like this in the context of judicial elections, which has radically changed judicial elections in this state compared to other states. In Illinois, they will spend $10 million on a Supreme Court election. You think, well, who's willing to spend $10 million in a Supreme Court election? And the answer is the insurance companies who get the benefit of the decisions of those Supreme Court justices. And there's very clear connections that even the judges, and surveys of judges say that they believe campaign contributions in judges' elections affect what judges do. Congressmen are at least smart enough to say, no. My decision. No, but judges are more honest. Yeah, of course it affects.
Last question, and then.
What really scares me is, and I think this is what you're saying, is that the counterbalancing effect in politics that we've grown up with and believed that next time we'll get you, that perhaps we've passed the point of no return, that money is now so all-powerful that the worst scenario we can't even predict, that we can't, in a normal process, reclaim the center or flip it the other way, which, my friends and I keep saying, we'll get them next time, and we've got to pull it together. But this monetary factor here, are you saying it's so all-powerful all of a sudden we've never experienced anything quite like this before?
It's absolutely the case. We have never been this deeply corrupted in the way the system functions, in the way the system functions. 100 years ago, there was a different kind of corruption. It was Rob Blagojevich corruption. It was, plain old simple, we're going to buy your vote kind of corruption. And at least that kind of corruption had shame that ran with it. Right? So it was under the covers. It was, above board everything seems fine, but under the covers, cash is secreted. Members of Congress until the mid part of the 20th century had safes in their office. Literally under the desk, there was a safe. So why would you pay members of Congress in cash? And they didn't. They just happened to find bags of cash on their desk. They needed a safe place to keep it. That kind of corruption is gone. The corruption we've now got is totally in plain sight. Everybody sees it. They're completely open about it. And the dramatic change in the culture, the norms that this brings about, is something that is very recent. So in 1982, John Stennis, who was head of the Armed Services Committee, no choir boy, but John Stennis was asked by a colleague to hold a fundraiser for defense contractors. And Stennis said, would it be proper for me to do this? I hold life and death over these companies. I don't think it'd be proper for me to raise money from them. That is a literally unutterable statement in Washington today. If you were a head of a committee chair, and you said, no, I shouldn't raise money from the people I regulate, people would think you've lost your brains, because that's the whole purpose of being the head of a committee chair. It has so completely changed the norms, they can't think any differently about it. And so, when you say, can we get back to the center of the middle? You tell me, on the critical money issues, what is the difference between the right and the left? The most dramatic example of this corruption is in financial services. Most dramatic example. It was Bill Clinton who launched us on the process that got us to the system which George Bush embraced and then bailed out, and then Barack Obama continued through. On the money issues, there's no Democrat and Republican Party. There's one party. On the social issues, when we can find a way to get people to hate each other, there's a very big difference between the Democrats and Republicans. So you're either really rallied up about gay marriage, or you're really rallied up about trying to stop abortion. Those are the issues that drive people to be passionate about politics and give money to politicians. And we increasingly see more polarization on those issues, because it gets more money into the system. But the scary thing to me is, when you look at the financial reform, 2008 brings down the economy, brings down Wall Street, brings down the economy. Everybody independent of it says it's because of the misregulation that happened from the period of 1992 on. People on the left, people on the right. Joe Stiglitz and Richard Posner agree on one thing. It is that misregulation brought us to the crisis in 2008. Okay, so we have the worst crisis since the Depression. We just saw statistics say 40% of American wealth disappeared because of that crisis. 40%. So then in 2008, we get a new president, new reform, promise of reform of the system. There has been no change in the fundamental architecture of that instability. If the banks were too big to fail in 2008, they're only too bigger to fail now. And why did we get no change? Because Wall Street had the power to blackmail Democrats and Republicans alike into bringing about no fundamental reform of the system. That is terrifying. It is literally the first time in American history we have had a financial crisis where the people who caused the crisis had enough power to block reform of the system. And when the worst crisis since the Depression cannot bring about political change powerful enough to reform the system, I think we have to be extremely worried. Because you pick your issue, we will get no change under this system. So I do think it's the worst it's ever been. Sorry, that's very depressing.
On that lovely note, let's thank you.